Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lunch and learn today from the Supply Chain Sustainability School. The title of today's event is Offsite and Modern Methods of Construction Procurement. And the format will be that I'm delighted to have with me two expert speakers in both procurement and offsite modern methods of construction. And we'll be talking a little bit later on in the session about the new DFMA, Design for Manufacturing and Assembly Overlay, to the Royal Institute of British Architects Plan of Work. We'll also be talking about our speakers' individual experiences, and hopefully they'll give us some stories of success in this field. My name is Dave Emery from the Supply Chain Sustainability School. I'd like, if I can, just to run through very quickly who the school is, what it does. So we're an organisation that essentially is a vast repository of learning materials, and I have some expert colleagues who can help train you and your supply chains in almost any aspect of construction. The way the school works is we are funded by over 140 partners. Typically those are tier 1 construction companies. I think we have all 10 of the top 10 house builders in the UK, institutions like CITB, Highways England, and so on. And there's a slight philanthropic part to the school, which is that we take money from our partners, but we use that money to deliver training to SMEs and tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers free of charge at the point of use. What we like to do with anybody engaging with the school is give them the opportunity to assess their own knowledge and competence in any particular area, and we can then target them with personalised learning plans that plug those gaps in the knowledge. And as you can see from that slide, we've had a great engagement. Over 17,000 companies have used our resources, and something over 60,000 individual learners, which, although we're very pleased with that, I think we have to put that in a context of a construction industry that employs best part of 4 million people. So we have a long way to go yet. The school was, as the name implies, Supply Chain Sustainability School. At its core is sustainability, but we offer 7 key topic areas. And I guess today's event, even though fundamentally it's around offsite construction, it will pull in elements, I'm sure, of sustainability, of lean principles, of management, and so on, and certainly procurement. So as far as our users are concerned, the information and the training is free, it's largely confidential, and it's all CPD accredited. And I invite you just to go and have a look at the resources, and if you wish, make yourself an account at supplychainschool.co.uk. That's enough from me. I'd like to introduce my two guests this afternoon. Tony Woods, who is the technical manager at LHC. Tony is responsible for the procurement of pre-tendered frameworks for offsite housing and modular buildings. And Katie Saunders, who is partner and head of Manchester construction practice at Trowes and Hamlins, and she specialises in construction and procurement law. Actually, Katie, can I invite you first of all to just give me a 60-second introduction, a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Yes, thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yes, I think the only things I was going to add to that, of course, my practice area is construction, but over the last few years, we've got more heavily involved in our clients, both in the public and private sectors, developing predominantly residential accommodation using modern methods of construction, and therefore we've had much more experience of the contracting forms and the issues that are going to come out in terms of different types of risk management, design and planning around MMC and DFMA projects.
Okay, thank you, Katie, because what we're going to talk about is this DFMA overlay to the RIBA Plan of Works, and fundamentally what it's going to promote or does promote is this sense of early engagement and collaboration, which sometimes has been difficult to work around existing contracts. So I'll be really interested to see what your thoughts are on this. Tony, if I was in an elevator with you for 60 seconds, what would you tell me about yourself?
Well, I'm Tony Woods, Group Technical Manager at LHC, responsible for our offsite frameworks. I've been working in the MMC industry for about the last 20 years, started off at BRE, then spent about 8 years out with offsite manufacturers, contractors delivering social housing private projects. And then the last 8 years I've been at LHC preparing and procuring frameworks for offsite housing. And those frameworks have delivered, I think, around about 5,000 units across the UK now.
Well, thank you. I suppose I should pitch in with my experience of MMC, which is I started working on architectural practices many years ago, and then spent a couple of decades in house building, 15 years with my own consultancy, where I worked on something like 60 or 70 offsite projects. And I've been talking to the industry about offsite and DFMA for, I don't know, 10 years or so. So thank you, guest speakers. Whoops. I guess I just wanted to introduce the RIBA plan of work for those who may not be familiar with it. In essence, this is a framework designed for architects to work through and to consider what are their roles and responsibilities at each stage of a construction project, from what they call stage 0 strategic definition. This is even before the project has been designed. This is the strategic thinking around the viability of a project, right through design, construction, delivery, and indeed in use. And earlier this year, this document was produced, which is the DFMA Overlay, which, as I mentioned earlier, seeks to find ways of describing what needs to happen differently if the client is considering a solution that involves offsite construction or modern methods of construction. And the key feature for me is the heat map that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, which at each stage in the RIBA workflow, and for each modern method of construction category, suggests who should be involved and when, and specifically it gives deadlines for when the latest that you can engage somebody in practical terms is. So that's really what we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Having described the framework, Katie, you actually contributed, didn't you, to the new document? Can you tell us what your contribution was?
Yes, and thanks for that summary. I mean, I think it's worth sort of mentioning that where the DFMA toolkit came from, the overlay came from. It was thought that architects such as Nigel Ostein of Hawkins Brown, who's obviously been working closely with other key figures in the industry looking at MMC and DFMA, such as Mark Farmer, that there was a need to sort of give some guidance to the architect practice on how to design and plan from an early stage. I think that message comes through loud and strong through the toolkit, saying, well, actually, the most important thing is to decide what you're going to do at an early stage and not try and switch from traditional to DFMA at a later stage of the project. So Mark Farmer actually, who gave the sort of preface and tried to explain where it came from, it's 4 reasons really. Response to the government, encouragement of DFMA, and we've seen that through the way that particularly in the housing sector, Homes England and GLA have been promoting use of DFMA in their new build construction projects, but also the way that central government has been promoting it through major central government programmes such as the Ministry of Justice Prisons Programme, and also the Department for Education, who've used offsite manufacturing for a long time. So really responding to that, and the government's publication of the construction playbook last year, which also promoted use of DFMA. And then really to demonstrate that you do need to structure construction projects, to structure construction projects differently, both in design and planning, and also on site and obviously off site. So give some steer to the designers on how to do that. And then the importance of making sure that digital information is fundamental to be produced throughout the stages of the project. So again, a key thing that's come out from a lot of reports into some of the problems with our construction sector, most notably the Hackett review, looking at the golden thread of information and making sure that from start to finish on a DFMA project, you have established that thread of digital information. And finally, that point that I've mentioned earlier, the bit about you can't retrofit DFMA into a traditionally designed and planned project, you have to do it at the start. So that's where the need for the guidance came from, and also trying to give the you know, anyone who wants to know more about this, active case studies is always really helpful. And I know we'll talk about this when we're going to have chats later, and with Tony's experience as well. Because actually that then brings everything to life rather than just theoretical sort of process mapping and ideas of how we can do things better.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with you that it's very much has been evident that you can't retrofit offsite and MMC solutions into a traditional design, and I think it's key that we set out the realistic timescales for decisions to be made. But Tony, I don't know, is it too early for this new overlay to have had any effect at procurement stage yet, or was it something you were already doing but this has now formalised it?
It's something we've been trying to do, which is trying to get the MMC manufacturers further upstream into the decision-making process. I think it is a cultural issue within the industry as a whole. It's not just architects, but it's clients that need to be engaged. You know, the traditional method of procurement is the client will find a piece of land, they'll employ an architect who will then do outline planning permission for them. Once they've got that outline planning permission, they'll then go to procurement with a view to getting a main contractor to do the work without much idea about whether it's going to be MMC or not. And historically the problem then is you're trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and this whole thing designed for manufacture has been lost because you're too far down the process. So you're trying to bring that further upstream, but also, as well as the architects, it's educating the client on their overall approach. I think you've got two different sectors. You've got sort of residential, and then you've got non-residential buildings. And as Katie said, you know, Ministry of Justice, Department for Education have already got big programs in, and they are bringing together aggregation of demand to be able to put out to the industry. With the housing market, it's a completely fragmented, different approach. You've got lots of organisations which are building across numbers of sites, so trying to get that aggregated demand is really difficult. So I hope, hopefully, with the overlay, it will start to get, you know, architects to look at actually that early engagement with the supply chain. And again, you can break those two up within the housing sector between private sector who don't have to follow procurement regulations, and then the public sector. You know, and you're seeing that with the private sector at the moment. People like Barratt's who are standardising their house designs for MMC. They're aiming to hit with it by 2025. 25% of all their houses will be built using MMC. So they're easier, more fleet of foot to be able to drive the changes through, and standardising their house designs to do that. And that's where we need to take the architects to be guiding the client, to inform them, you know, on this program of work. And I think, again, the difference between sort of residential projects and commercial buildings is they're larger projects, the commercial ones, so there's more return on the investment for everybody in that particular program. But again, in general terms, I know the construction industry, we still lose a lot of that knowledge and experience, because you bring together a project team and then that team dissipates, and then you form another team for the next project.
I do think it's very laudable that the RIBA have produced this work with the likes of Katie and others who've helped. And it's clearly aimed at architects, but actually I fundamentally agree with you, Tony, that it's just as useful a document to be educating clients with, isn't it? To make those early decisions, to encourage that collaborative approach and that early engagement.
David, oh, sorry, I'll pop in there, because there's been a really good question sort of saying why can you not sort of retrofit? And I think actually
I was just going to address that question actually, and encourage anyone in the audience, if you've got questions as we go along, please do as Simon Griffiths has done. Please type any questions in the chat box. But just let me read out the question and then I'll get you to respond to it, Katie. So Simon asks, it's often said that offsite can't be retrofitted in traditional design. Why? What makes it difficult? Is it just practical issues such as site access, or is it specific to the actual design issues? Katie, what's your take on that?
Well, I suppose I was just going to sort of ground us in what we're talking about here, and I think because we're talking DFMA as sort of generally, there is within the overlay reference to the sort of 7 categories of DFMA, which have been defined by government. I think that's the sort of starting point. So I think when probably Tony, I, myself, and David, we're talking about sort of categories 1 and 2. So where we're talking fully volumetric, and I'll leave Tony and yourself to give more the technical explanation. But I just see that as, the boxes, they're obviously much more technical than that. But where you're actually building everything within the factory and then really transporting that and craning that to site. And then the category 2 is panels and timber frames. So those are where the major parts of the construction happen in the factory. And then the categories go sort of steadily down as less and less happens in the factory. But some of towards category 6 and 7, it's more about improving processes, often on and off site, and looking at those sorts of aspects, improving the method of construction. But for DFMA, of course, what we're talking about is really where majority is happening off site. And then turning to the question, which is why can't you retrofit? Well, there's 2 things really. One is the planning process. It's been really hard for people to actually plan and design a traditional project and then switch it to a fully volumetric or indeed much more panelized or timber frame system, because the planners won't just sign that off, even if it looks the same from the outside. And Tony's probably got some examples of that. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect, of course, is what Tony was saying, is that we need to bring the manufacturers into the process much earlier. There's no point getting the architect to design a traditional design and then saying, right, go and build that in the factory. That doesn't work. We're really shifting things around, saying this is the product that's been designed and built and manufactured in this factory, and that has to then go to site. It's not the reverse. And that's a very simple, probably, way of doing it. But that's why it's very important to start from the top on this.
A couple of simple, for Simon's benefit, a couple of simple examples of my experience. When you build multi-storey volumetric modular buildings, each box, as it were, needs a floor and it needs a lid, and the box that sits above it has its own floor and its own lid. So suddenly you find that at each story level you're effectively doubling up on the structure, and on a tall multi-storey building that can actually increase the overall height of the building, which, as Katie said, the planners may not accept, and that could actually reduce the available units. Other simple things, when you set out a grid to design a building, very often it's the architects tend to put a wall right down the centre of in the volumetric modular on different modules. So we need to think about it. Tony, any thoughts on that, or am I the design guy?
I would agree with you. Katie hit the nail on the head. Planning. If a client has got a building through planning, and then they start looking at off-site manufacturing, and to design for manufacture is that balance between design, manufacture and installation. So you've got to balance all sides of the triangle out. So if you have a project and you're trying then getting the manufacturer to look at how they can actually produce it in a cost-effective manner within their manufacturing processes, then lies a problem if they turn around to the client and say, well, yes, we can build this, but we can make it cheaper, but you'll need to change floor to ceiling heights, which affects the planning. At that point, the client's face will drain to white, thinking it's just taken me 18 months, 2 years to get this through planning. The last thing I want to do is to go back through planning again. And an example of that is we work with a company up in Scotland, CCG. They do a closed panel system. They started, they were a construction company. They build with timber frame because 85% of all the housing up in Scotland is timber frame. And they decided to build their own factory. But because they were in control of the design, and one of the simple things was floor to ceiling heights, they were in control of that. They could save between £200,000 and £300,000 a year just on plasterboard by being able to control floor to ceiling height to make sure it's either 2.4 or 2.6 meters, which means I use a sheet of plasterboard rather than something in between. So that's what we're talking about. That's a good example of design for manufacturer. So you can actually get as much benefit out of the manufacturing process as possible.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony. So coming back to the DFMA overlay, what do you think are the key areas of guidance that this document's introduced? Katie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying that the preliminary introduction, yeah, beyond what Mark Farmer has said, there's also an analysis of the benefits of using DFMA, and I think that's really powerful for anyone. Just as if you haven't already thought this is a good idea, talking about the benefits of sustainability, the cost and use, speed obviously has been something that's been focused on in terms of speed of construction on site. Once you've obviously constructed the majority of the project off site, means that the speed on site is very fast. But I think what most people are interested in is the quality and the sustainability of the finished products, and that's something that it is really useful to just have a quick read of. Then I think the other elements of the overlay are talking around process, when to start talking to suppliers and manufacturers, how to build that, how to design the project in order to make it suitable for the manufacturing sector, and sort of changing your mindset, this key issue about dealing directly with manufacturers, I think, and that's something that the sector hasn't really adapted to, particularly from the client side, as well as they should do. I know we've got a variety of audience members listening and watching, some who are main contractors, some who are supply chain members, and some obviously on the client side. But from the client's perspective, often we advise the client side, they're just not switched into dealing with the manufacturing direct. There's one reason for that, because often they're public sector bodies and they have to go out and procure that. And that's something, stumbling block they have to come over with. And secondly, you're used to having a sort of tier one contractor to do that for them. So that's one of the aspects. And I don't know whether Tony wants to sort of focus on that, because I think that's the change management aspect of how the designers fit into that process, but also how they educate their clients and the supply chain to improve that interface between ultimate client and supply chain members.
I think that's one of the things we found when we embarked on the whole procurement of frameworks for MMC back in 2014. We started off with a modular framework and a panelised framework with a view that same way as we have with, we have a kitchen framework where clients can go to a manufacturer and buy kitchens, which they then install in their properties. However, we found very quickly that because of the risk profile, and Katie touched on that clients are looking for somebody who can offer the main contractor role. And again, if you look historically, and I'm sure David you'll back this up, is that there's many cases where a contractor takes an MMC system, puts it in, everybody remembers the MMC system when it goes wrong, but they never remember the name of the contractor who actually built it in the first place. So yeah. I think from that point of view, there's certainly a vested interest for manufacturers to start to become contractors. And certainly from our point, that's the way our frameworks have developed into more about people being able to offer that main contractor role, because they're in more control of their destiny. With interfaces with groundworks and everything else, rather than, I guess, historically we found is if the client tries to do it by themselves, they've employed a groundworker and a off-site manufacturer, and the stuff doesn't fit together. The last thing they want to see is sitting on one side of the table while the two parties are pointing fingers at each other and blaming the other person for it. The client just wants their project delivered. So looking at that, of a complete package being delivered by an organisation makes it more effective for them. And you're seeing now with the tier one contractors starting to integrate their supply chain into their organisation as well. So having that integrated approach makes it smoother and safer for everybody from that point of view. And I think there's still this thing, we've still got a number of manufacturers, certainly with panelised systems, where they are manufacturers and they approach to clients via a tier one contractor. But again, they're manufacturers for a good reason, because the risk profile of manufacturing is far less than becoming a main contractor. As we all know, as soon as you enter into contractual obligations, you've got all sorts of issues, and that's what Katie thrives on, I'm sure, from that point of view. So they stay as manufacturers for a very good reason. And one of the questions is, I notice in the overlay, it's about this integration, getting specialist people in, and that's certainly one of the things we've looked at as well. And we've now got an offsite project integrator, this specialist organisation that can assist the client, the architects and the manufacturers to work together and try and ease through these issues, because many clients are coming to this new, they don't have an understanding and they need that advice. And the same for architects, you know, they're coming into this, they want to get the best building that they can, but our only way to do that is actually integrate the manufacturers and others, and they may need the assistance of a specialist to be able to do that as well.
I think that specialist is is designated the MMC Consultant, isn't he, in the new framework?
Yeah, our terminology is the Offsite Project Integrator, but there we go.
Offsite project, okay. And I guess he or she could be from any one of a number of backgrounds. It could be someone with an architectural background, perhaps a project management type background, perhaps from a manufacturing background. Have you seen people emerge from all these different backgrounds to take on that role?
Yes, we have. There's a number of consultants that have come out and do that side of things. Some have got specialists who work with the Department for Education to do that. So there's a range of organisations that can actually offer that service to people. But again, it's getting the right guidance. And one of the things I touch on is, again, our experience over the last 8 years is everybody does pilot projects, you know, and if they've already got it through planning, then sometimes those projects don't run as smoothly as they could. And we had one particular project for a council which was looking originally at a garage site. So again, they picked a difficult site, small site, low volumes. It was meant to be 2 bungalows, and 18 months later they built 4 flats. So the planning permission changed about 3 times, which wasn't good. The cost escalated, and if you sit down and look at it, if you're doing pilot projects, you say, well, it costs too much money and it took too long, so why would we do that? So one of the things we're trying to get clients to think about now, a pilot project is for them to understand the process. Most of the manufacturers we have out in the market are very good at what they do now, and it's more about the client understanding what they need to do, and it's their learning process. And the point of a pilot is we do it as a pilot so we can actually take that knowledge to the next project and make it better. From that point of view.
I want to talk about what value and success looks like in an Offsite and MMC project. Just before that, I'm going to ask you, Tony, a bit of a loaded question here, because it seems to me that if the function of the overlay is to encourage that early collaboration and discussions with the clients, and somehow to make contractual arrangements work to enable that, doesn't a framework already do that? Don't framework members have all these benefits?
Well, I think, and Katie will probably touch on this because I'm sure she was involved in the overlay, and it does mention about procurement within there and the public sector as well. So yeah, I think that's one of the things with pre-tender framework. You've got that option of early engagement with the supply chain. If you don't have that route and you're in the public sector, then you've got that whole issue of, if you start engaging with one contractor, are you giving them an unfair advantage when it comes to tendering for the project? But that's certainly one of the things we're trying to say to people, is you can start to have earlier conversations through a pre-tendered framework with that supply chain. And what we're trying to do is get people to talk even at the feasibility stage, you know, when they're sitting at that stage 1 with the architect. It mentions in the overlay about looking at logistics and things like that. Again, you know, if you've got the manufacturers involved, they can start to look at things like the size of the modules as well. Because we found in the past, sometimes people think, well, the bigger is better. But again, if you take into that triangle of design, manufacture and installation, you need to balance all those. And certainly we found with one of our clients, Magna, who worked down in the southwest, bigger sometimes isn't better when you're trying to get to some of those sites, you know, down the country lanes and things like that. So you've got to balance that up. And certainly the infrastructure in the UK sometimes makes it quite difficult, even in sort of southeast London, where you've got railway lines crisscrossing all over the place with bridges. Yeah. It becomes difficult to get into those locations. I think Katie was about to say something.
Well, I was about to ask her a question as well. On the basis, Katie, that I guess as a lawyer, you generally get involved when things don't go well. In your experiences, do frameworks deliver better projects and better relationships in the main?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I leave it up to my colleagues to do the things not going well bit. I hopefully stay the right side of the good times. So I think there's a couple of points that come out of that. One is volume and sort of aggregating demand. And Tony mentioned a bit about the fact that often, public sector in particular, like to do a pilot to test it out, test that innovation, and then move on from there. And I think we have seen that happening a lot over the last few years. But in the most recent years, we have now managed to aggregate some of those clients together. And Tony's done his hard work at LHC, and certainly we've been working with organisations like Building Better, which are aggregating the demand of a lot of clients who want to do a lot of pilots, and then being able to do all those pilots sort of through the same manufacturers, which potentially deals with this issue that was raised on a question about what happens if manufacturers don't have the financial security, and that's often caused by the fact that they're only getting pilot projects fed to them. So let's aggregate the pilots so they do have much more volume, so therefore they don't get to the brink of being having cash flow issues. So I think that was just picking up on that. In terms of do the frameworks operate as you want them to, yes, certainly it's a great method really to bring together a number of clients, whether at one client and several projects. That's certainly how the central government operates, and then being able to smooth that workflow across those frameworks providers. And then within that framework, having that mechanism, as you said, to work collaboratively on individual projects at an early stage, to get involved, to standardise some components together, to look at common supply chains, to where are the issues? Have we got a problem with steel? Can we then collaborate on steel? Can we collaborate on timber? I'm making it sound very basic, but because I know it's much more technical than that, but those are things that we've seen frameworks operating. So that's where the benefits can come. And then you can also standardise the way that you procure those projects as well on an individual basis, and make it easy to get from design to production and installation.
I'm glad you mentioned the standardisation. That relates actually to a question I can see from Simon, which I'll come back to in a moment. I just wanted to give you one of my recent experiences with the school, which was that we ran a workshop between a public sector client, who I shan't name. There may be people on this call who are part of that framework, but they had a framework that involved 5 off-site modular manufacturers supplying to them. And the reason we ran the workshop, it was really to bring the two parties together, or the two sides together, so that each could explain to the other some of the day-to-day difficulties they face. And in particular, the off-site manufacturers wanted to say to the procurers, if only you did things slightly differently, we could offer you a better solution. And I think because fundamentally they didn't understand some of the MMC and off-site concepts, the off-site manufacturers were therefore forced to shoehorn a solution in with a system that it didn't really fit. And question from Simon in the audience: how easily can one off-site manufacturer's design be taken over by another if, for example, they go bust? For me, this is one of the concerns that I suspect clients have, is what happens if I've got a half-finished project and my supplier fails. From my own experience, I know there was some work done called Project Seismic 2 years ago, which was an Innovate UK funded project that involved the DFE. I think Brydenwood were the architects. There were at least 2 modular manufacturers on that, and they tried to assess, well, what's the intellectual property in our particular collection of bits of steel and wood that make up the boxes, that make up the buildings. And they did some great work on rationalising the number of components that both manufacturers used. They designed a universal connector, and the whole concept of the project was that actually if this was standardised across the industry, it would reassure the clients, it would increase the manufacturing capacity, because if one company was working 3 shifts a day and couldn't accommodate any more, they could sub it out to a rival company. So there's work being done. I'm sorry, I'm talking and you're the 2 experts. Tony, have you had any experience in this?
Well, yeah, I think we'll find Seismic 2 is on its way as well. If you look at, particularly light gauge steel frame, light gauge steel frame varies a little bit, but the basics are very similar. I think it's more, the IP is more in the processes that the manufacturers use rather than actually in the products, because looking out the market at the moment, there's not a lot of new products. We're using standard construction materials. We're just manufacturing them, under better conditions in a factory at the moment. So yes. I think from that point of view, there's not so much of a problem. I think there is still this concern and risk, as you say, about manufacturers going out of business, and we've had a few of those recently. So again, it comes down to that thing of, as Katie touched on, and I think we've both been working on for a number of years now, is this aggregation of demand. If you can start to aggregate a demand through a manufacturer, then they can start to make the investment and they can commit to you because you're committing to them. You know, and that then flows on to things like social value and everything else. We've seen over the last few years a lot of people wanting, you know, they've got a demand for housing and they want a factory in their area. But when you start to ask them, can you actually commit to providing volume for the factory, particularly with the public sector, that becomes very difficult to get people to commit to doing that, and it tends to sort of slip away quite rapidly. So again, this whole issue about capacity in the marketplace, we've got a lot of manufacturers there at the moment which aren't working at the 3 shifts. So if we can actually get them to top up to get up to capacity, and then the way I've always approached it, so well, if you can commit the volume in a particular region, I'm sure the manufacturers will be happy to project into that area from where they are based at the moment to then start to deliver what you need. But it's got to be working in a partnership. And I think the whole construction playbook is looking about that long-term relationship and long-term commitment. And if you look at, in general terms, the way the construction industry is at the moment with lack of labour, resources and things like that, it's about having a long-term commitment. It's shaking up the way we procure to have that relationship with people rather than doing it on a case-by-case basis, and we're doing it on a design and build adversarial, you know, where we throw the hand grenade over and expect them to take the risk. It's actually working in a long-term partnership. You know, that's when we're talking about manufacturing, we always talk about the automotive industry. The automotive industry, they have long-term relationships with their tier 1, tier 2 contractors over a number of years with a view to reducing cost over that period of time by working closely with their supply chain and understanding how their supply chain works and working out the most efficient way for them to integrate into what they're trying to achieve. So we need to change our complete approach, and you know, the contracts we use as well. You know, I found over the years, a lot of our clients don't understand with the design and build, you're passing the risk on to the contractor. You know, and again, from the contractor's point of view, when I worked for a smaller contractor, our contracts advisor, he said to us, if it's design and build, work out how much it is and add 25% on top for the risk. And clients don't understand that sometimes that they've got to pay for that risk. So if you go for the cheapest person, have they actually added the risk in, or they're keeping their fingers crossed because they'll get through it somehow? And as we know, if you're in the middle of a contract and the contractor starts running out of money, what are you going to do as a client? You need that project completed. So I think,
Katie, sorry, Tony, to interrupt. Katie, any thoughts on that? Is first of all, is this nervousness amongst clients real, and are they justified in being nervous about the ability of the market to supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly with the public sector, when you're spending public money, you do need to be conscious that you spend it wisely. So, and they're naturally therefore cautious. So I think we've seen within the public sector more reticence, and this again back to the pilots. Whereas in the private sector, obviously, they have recognised that they can commit, and once they commit, they want to go, and you know, this is where the benefits come of using DFMA. But I suppose in the background, you've talked about standardization as coming, and that's going to help deal with this issue of being able to switch manufacturer potentially. Another issue that's the Offsite Alliance, which is an alliance of SMEs and manufacturers working in offsite. They have come up with, and they're working with government on a sort of government-backed guarantee scheme, so that actually on schemes where they're operating, they get some sort of bond. They don't have to go and get a bond themselves to support, you know, what would happen if things went wrong. So the client is reassured that they have some money in their back pocket in order to try and go to another manufacturer. So those are sort of solutions happening in the background. If you were about to embark on a DFMA project today and you were a public sector client and you were worried about this, I think there's a number of things you should be doing. One is obviously getting to know your manufacturer and getting in the number, and then going to see the factory, because I think that's really powerful to understand why actually the way that the factories operate means it's not necessarily the sensible thing to do. So we want to have vesting certificates, we want to stick our little names on each bit of the component parts as to say that's ours, because we'll come and get it when things go wrong, and we'll get it out of the factory. Exactly. I mean, and I think that's a powerful message. I've certainly done that myself, and I thought, well, actually, it doesn't seem to work like that. That would, you have a whole pile of materials put aside for a particular client, and they're all going to then go into production. It's much more sensible is to be sensible about your cash flow. To recognise that on a DFMA project, you've got to pay up front. You've got to make that commitment up front. And yes, you're going to have to take a leap of faith in some of that, or get some bonds and guarantees to support it. But that bit, that pump priming, is the bit that makes your project get through the production line and be bespoke for you. So you've got to shift the way that we often hold back, particularly in the public sector, not pay anything for as late as possible. We've got to get grant funding regimes, and they're certainly coming through on this, to say if you're getting public sector grant through GLA Homes England, for example, on the housing side, they've got to bring their grant funding structures in line with this process. And yes, look at the way that you can protect against potentially a manufacturer going bust, looking at buddying up systems with another manufacturer, and look at some sort of insurance-backed bonds to provide government or insurance-backed bonds to provide that security, so you can give that money over with the reassurance that it's not disappearing, but it's actually helping get that project going.
I love that phrase, the pump priming. I thought that is a great way of describing actually just putting that capital in to get things happen. So question for either of you, what do we think the client needs to understand? What's the key thing the client needs to do differently or understand about the different procurement route? If there's one change.
Chip in first. I mean, I didn't sort of finish off with the point that Tony was getting at as well, is you've got to change the way you contract. So I suppose all of that goes into the fact that you're not going to be just throwing a design and build contract at a manufacturer and saying exactly what Tony said before, this is the way we're going to approach it. You've got to restructure what you're doing with the contractor, main contractor, or the manufacturer, or both together. You've got to look at multi-party arrangements. You've got to use a framework. And this is legal things, which is obviously what I'd be saying. Look at frameworks, look at alliancing forms of contract, look at long-term planning in order to give some certainty to the manufacturer in terms of pipeline, and obviously start and engage early with the manufacturing side.
Yeah, I'd join in with that, and also say that it can take a long time. We've been working with Magna Housing Association now for probably nearly 7 years, and it takes that visionary within the organisation to actually align their own internal aggregation demand for an organisation, first of all, to go down that route, to start to say they're going to partner with a manufacturer, they're going to bring together all their sites that they're planning together, those that they know of and those that they don't know of, to bring that together as a complete package of work. So I liken it a bit like a river, coming down the mountain. It slowly grows, and then you can bring other people into that, but you need the catalyst, the organisation that's going to be heading down that way first of all, because again, looking at the whole issue of aggregation of demand, as Katie touched on, things that you highlight which have caused problems historically in the past with these consortiums or groups that come together are designs. Can you actually agree on a standard house type? And even though we have, space standards and everything else, we still manage to design, particularly social housing, slightly different every time. So can you get the clients to agree on that? And then even on the JCT contract, and Katie, you're probably joining in here, that most clients have got 27 pages of amendments for a JCT contract, which sort of defeats the object of a JCT contract. But again, if you're trying to bring lots of clients together and they've all got slightly different contractual conditions, how does that sit together as well? So we've got to train, as Katie said, we've got to change this whole approach to contract and actually getting people working in partnership. We try and promote two-stage process now with the PCSA, so that when the client's looking at the feasibility, they can actually work with the supply chain to develop the design before they get there, so they can minimise the risks for all parties and make the project more efficient going forward.
On on that topic of risk, I think we've talked about the perceived risk of the supply chain failure. What are the other risks from a client's point of view, Katie, of opting for an offsite or MMC solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are obvious points to the audience. Clearly logistics. You're going to be moving things that have been built in the factory onto site. You've got to think about that. You've got to think about insurance. You've got to think about the fact that you are not inspecting on site, you're inspecting in the factory. We've got building safety bill coming in, the Act coming into force next year, which talks about obviously fire risk. And I think that's important to make sure that you are working with your manufacturer in terms of all the obligations that you as a client, if you're developing housing in particular, or any sort of residential accommodation, that you've built that into your process as well. So I think, I think the main risk is that not knowing what you're getting into is that lack of education and not taking on board the right advisors at the time. And again, the point about shoehorning a traditional project into a DFMA project or the other way around, you can't do that. You've got to start from the top.
Yeah. Tony, any risks that you think of that we haven't covered?
I think Katie's covered most of it. It's that early engagement, making it clear from the start that you wish to go down the route of MMC and making sure you get the right advice and guidance to do it, and not picking a project that's perhaps already too far down the line. If you've already got planning on it, possibly it could be too late unless you're willing to go back to planning again, because we've spoken about this design for manufacture. And that's where you've got to be thinking. I mean, when you do the design work, you've got to think about how are we going to manufacture this? What is the most efficient way to do that? And the only real way to do that is engage with the supply chain when you're making those decisions, because they're the experts in manufacturing. And again, it's simple things. You touched on the issue of floor to ceiling heights. Now floor to ceiling height, a joist that's used in a building, it may be very good reason the manufacturer standardise on a certain size joist because it's more cost effective. They've got a better production, they can get better delivery rather than trying to design a joist specifically for a job. Having a standard, we touched on standard component that I can use on every one of my buildings, which makes it more cost effective for my supply chain to supply it to me. I've got less controls I need to have place in manufacturing because I'm using the same component all the time, and it makes it more straightforward from that point of view. So having that design for manufacture bit in there, those are the little bits that can make the biggest difference.
You're talking about that standardization of components and process, I think touches on Simon again. He says, sorry, in the panel, Simon, sorry, me again, exclamation mark. How engaged are frameworks with component manufacturers? Seems from experience that it's more about the offsite manufacturer when actually the component manufacturers have a lot to contribute in supplying materials to suit this form of construction. I think you're right, Simon. I do think, I think Tony earlier said what we're actually doing in a lot of offsite manufacture at the moment is we're building sites under a roof, whereas what we actually need to develop is an industrialization mindset where we have a relationship with our whole supply chain. So from a modular manufacturer's point of view, they will be bringing in the experts from their component suppliers, and they will be collaborating with them to drive efficiencies and drive down costs in the long run. So I think, yes, a very, very crucial point you've made, and one would hope that the offsite manufacturers are indeed doing that work with their own suppliers.
I would touch on that as well. I'd just say with public sector procurement, it depends what the touch point is for the client, so they'll invariably be a main contractor, or an offsite manufacturer will be the person they'll contract with, and then it's their responsibility to sort out the rest of the supply chain. So it's very difficult for us to put together a framework of components, because the question is, would clients procure those individual components to then put into something else? Now you can sort of do that in a certain way, but we tried that with our offsite framework where we had framing manufacturers, and clients didn't use it. you know, because again, it's a component which then feeds in. You need somebody else to deliver that. So there's always contracting a tier one contractor. Now, in theory, under procurement regulations, if you've got a component which is covered by a framework, then the client can specify that within their documentation. We haven't found it's happened yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, obviously it is important to try and understand where those components are coming from, because that's some of the key theme of the building safety regime, and sort of having that digital thread of information about where it's coming. So regardless of how you're procuring that, to some degree, you've still got to keep a handle on that and to know every bit that's gone into your finished unit, I suppose.
Well, I mean, sorry, David, just quickly touching on that, you know, there's a lot of emphasis that's put on offsite manufacturers when they all operate in factories. They've all got quality systems, they've got document control and things in place, and it'd be nice to see some of these things we're asking offsite manufacturers to do to be reflected on a traditional building site. You know, if you went to a traditional building site and said to the dry liners or a bricklayer, where's the procedure for the work you're doing, you probably have to duck, because you'd either have a brick or a drill thrown at you and tell you where the door is at that point. So I think these things are all great from the safety bill point of view, but it should be across the industry. So we know the offsite manufacturers are already doing all these things. Well, how about everybody else following suit and having those quality systems and procedures in place?
I tell a story sometimes of one of our partner companies, and it's a good job I can't remember which one it is, because then I won't inadvertently let the name slip out. But they ordered 150 bathroom modules, I think, bathroom pods from Italy, and duly installed them. And I don't know how they found out, but somebody found out that in Italy, the waste from a shower doesn't require a trap under their building regulations. But of course, according to UK regulations, it does. So you can imagine the magnitude of that tiny little detail replicated 150 times was huge. We're running into the last few minutes. I'd like to ask you both about you know, the value in this type of solution, because I'm conscious that it's really difficult at the state of the industry at the moment to say hand on heart that an offsite or modular solution or MMC solution will be cheaper in terms of capital cost. But how do we value? How do we assess the value of these solutions? Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go first. First of all, hot off the press today at the Constructing Excellence Conference, the BRE and the Bristol Housing Festival launched a sort of a measurement toolkit of how to measure it, which is great. And there'll be obviously more standardization across the sector to do this, to measure that. So that's, you know, what you can measure. How do you determine what you're measuring is the right thing, I suppose, as you're saying, David, from the start. So what we are sort of talking to clients about, if they want to go down this route, is, you know, first of all, is that the right decision for them? Have they got the right site? Have they got the commitment, all the things we talked about? Have they got the risk appetite? And then secondly, you know, how are they going to select the right providers? And of course, Tony can explain more about that in terms of how to procure onto a framework. But certainly we've looked at getting away from lowest price, clearly looking at the value in terms of social value potentially, and that's been a struggle, because you mentioned the point about factories being local but not being, you know, are they local and therefore there's labour locally, or if they're not local, does that mean there isn't any social value? And I think we've addressed that and thought that, of course, clearly where there's social value and job creation happening outside your regional area, that can still be scored and marked as being social value. And then the cost in use, the maintenance costs, looking at energy efficiency, sustainability. So again, a number of things where we've now got data on this. And actually do commend the Bristol Housing Festival, who were working with Bristol City Council, done quite a lot of data around this and put together a sort of digital toolkit on this, which obviously LHC have been involved in as well. And that data is fantastic, because actually the getting some evidence, not just from case studies, which are part of the DFMA toolkit, but the actual real life data is saying that this particular product can demonstrate that it is either cheaper, but if it's not cheaper, then it has lower maintenance costs, and it's got lower and higher energy efficiency. So those are the basics that you would be trying to measure to address whether this is a better value. just do a little on the side before I hand over to Tony. You can talk a bit more about the digital toolkit and LHC's procurement methods, but is that we're working with Building Better, who are a group of housing associations, and they said they procured their first project, and actually the cost came out the same as traditional, which is, you know, it's great. I'm sure Tony's got some examples of that as well, but it's good to hear that you're not trying to look for other reasons to then necessarily go forward. If, you know, if the costs are commensurate, then it, you know, get all the added value as well.
Thank you. I mean, it does instinctively seem to me that the extraordinary levels of waste that we accept on a traditional construction site can be largely driven out by the factory process. So instinctively, it feels like it should be more efficient and effective and cost effective. Just before I ask you to comment, Tony, my colleague, to ladies and gentlemen in the audience, my colleague Naomi in a moment will paste in a link to a feedback form. Would very much like you to take just a minute or two, either between now and the end of the session or just after the session. Please give us your comments and feedback. It's really important to us as a school that we're funded by the industry. We need to demonstrate to the industry that we're doing things well and we're doing things right. So, Tony, value, how do you guide or measure value?
Well, I think some of the things that we're looking at going forward are things like the Future Home Standard. So when you're looking at MMC and the Future Home Standard, how do we meet the passive house requirements, net zero carbon? So you're looking at more insulation being built in the building, which means you're starting to look at using offsite to deliver those solutions. And that leads on to, you know, giving you more consistent performance for energy efficiency, air tightness, and I know Katie's touched on it, you know, golden thread, fire safety. You know what the components are that are going into that building. You've got a clear list. You know, digital side of things, you'll have a full set of drawings of the building as it's actually built, rather than we tends to be with construction is you have the designer's drawings, you have some build drawings, and then if you're lucky, somebody will go back and do the as-built drawings, which are an indication of what you might actually have on site, but you're never quite sure until you do the maintenance work and find the as-built drawings don't actually match what was actually built from that point of view. So I think that's you know, an important part of it, to say that added value. And there was a study recently looking, as Katie touched on, that the difference between going for the cheapest price and then how much it actually cost you to maintain that building. So again, looking at bringing the building maintenance team with the capital outlay team together and actually getting better value. So rather than driving down the cost and say, well, MMC is actually cheaper, it's actually better value. I think we both like that, Katie, from the point of view of procurement, don't we? It represents better value, you know, and you're starting to look at things like whole life costing. How can we look at that and bring that into the procurement process to validate that? So there should be less defects in the buildings that are built off-site. So over the life of the building, it's going to be more efficient. So it may cost you slightly more, but again, we're talking about the materials. You know, better materials in the start of the building means that you're going to have a better outcome over the life expectancy of the building. That's another aspect that we've got to change with the clients to understand that side of things as well. You know, and I think that's one of the things, as Katie touched on with Building Better, when you start to get the volumes of houses up through aggregated demand, then you can start to drive the costs down. Where we currently have with our procurement, which is public sector procurement, we procure it site by site. We redesign every house again and again. It all adds cost to the process. We do it in the most difficult way. Nothing is standardized in the design of the houses, you know, and we want to be at the model of, you know, Barratt's price point, but you look at what they're doing. They standardize their houses and they then make them great places for people to live, rather than looking at the individual buildings themselves. You know, they have their standard designs which they roll out across the country.
On the subject of value, one of my favourite quotes, and I have to paraphrase it, was by astronaut John Glenn, who said, "I was hurtling through space at 14,000 miles an hour, and all I could think of was every part of this spaceship was procured at the lowest price." Anyway, I did ask you both to have a case study ready. And on the one hand, I'm really disappointed that we haven't got time to go into your case studies. On the other hand, I'm delighted that we haven't, because that means we've had great conversation and great input from you. So I'm really delighted to have been able to host this session with two industry experts. I can see some great positive feedback popping up in the chat box. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you will take the time as well to fill in our feedback form. If I were to close my eyes now and imagine what you are doing while you're watching it, I imagine the audience is breaking out into rapturous and spontaneous applause at the quality of our two guest speakers. So I'm really grateful to you both. I thank you very much for your time and effort today. And I hope we can put on some similar events for our audience in the future. Meanwhile, thank you
very
Casey.
much.
At precisely 2 o'clock with perfect timing, I'm going to draw the session to a close. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.